Let's start here with a look at the process of binding data to controls in ASP.NET. At its core, it's pretty straightforward. Any control that supports data binding needs to have two features. One is a property called data source. So it must have a public property called data source, which accepts any object, although it typically is going to be an enumerable collection of something. And then it needs to define a method called data bind. Also public, and the way you work with data-bound controls in ASP.NET is you set their data source property to some collection of data, and then you call their data bind method to have them bring that data into their internal collection and prepare for presentation. So let's go ahead and try performing some simple data binding in ASP.NET. Okay, so to try out some data binding in ASP.NET, I'm going to create a new website, and let's just call this our data binding demos website. And to give ourselves something to look at, I have a SQL Server Express database here called Movie Reviews that contains a number of movies and reviews. So we'll have something to try out. And I also have the connection string to the local SQL Express database prepared here, so we don't need to type that in. Okay, so what I'd like to do is bind the movies to a grid. So let's just put an instance of the grid view onto our page. This is one of the controls that gives you sort of the most bang for your buck. It'll show all of the rows in the result set, and it'll set up the columns for you based on the metadata. And let's call this our movies grid. And just to show you what's in the database, so you can see what we're trying to retrieve here, let's open it up and notice there are two tables. There's movies and reviews. What I'm going to do is pull out movies from the movies table, and let's get maybe the top 20, and we'll retrieve those three columns. So let me go into our code behind and go ahead and retrieve data, and then populate the grid view with that data using the data source property and calling data bind like I showed you on the slide. So first we're going to bring in a couple of ADO.NET classes or namespaces, system.data, and using system.data.SQL client, which is the SQL Server provider namespace. And let's go ahead and create a SQL connection. And we'll set that equal to a new SQL connection, and we'll prepare a data source name right here, string DSN. We'll set that equal to that string that I copied in from the file. Okay, and once we have the connection, we're going to create a SQL command to go retrieve data. And this will be a SQL command, and we'll initialize that to select top 20, movie ID. Let's see what those columns were again. Title and release date. So title and release date from movies. And we'll pass in the connection that we just prepared. Now I'm putting these in a using block so that they are properly disposed of by the time you get down to this terminating brace down here. Okay, so I have a SQL command ready to go. Let's open the connection, knowing that it will be closed at the termination of this block with the using statement, and go ahead and bind the result of that query to my grid view. So inside of here, let's go ahead and prepare a SQL data reader. So reader, set that equal to command.execute reader, execute reader. So that'll return the results from our query back. And then we're going to take our movies grid.data source, so this is the key to data binding right here, and set that equal to the reader. And then movies grid.data bind is how you actually perform the binding. And I have a problem in my string up here. I forgot to escape my backslashes. Let's do that. And we should be good to go. Okay, so let's retrieve the data. So again, what the process of data binding is just setting the data source property and invoking the data bind method on the control. all of this is just the data access code to retrieve some data, we could equally be doing this with a intermediate data access layer, a set of classes, an array of elements or whatever. So let's try running the page now. And with any luck, we'll see the top 20 movies inside of the database. Great. So that's the sort of basics of data binding in ASP.NET. Now, what actually happens when you perform that data binding is we set the data source control. When you invoke data bind, that causes the control to retrieve data from the data source that you initialized, and it's going to create its own local cache of that data, just so that it can keep it around between the time when you bind the data and the time that it actually needs to render the data out to the response. So that's the process. You set up the data source called data bind, creates a local cache with its own copy of the data, and eventually renders it back to the client.